There's too much evil in this world for a good God to exist. This is something I'm sure we've all heard at one time or another. It was quoted by Lex Luthor in Superman Dawn of Justice, or Batman and Superman, rather. But when we're asked the question, why is it that evil exists? When we hear the objection, how can a good God exist if there's evil in this world? The existence of evil proves there's no such thing as God. We first need to take into consideration not only what the objective is not only saying, the objection rather, but also what the objection assumes. Because if our premises are all correct, then the conclusion is also correct. But if we make false assumptions and misrepresent a position, it doesn't matter how logically coherent the argument is, it's based on something that's false. And if you play with something non-existent, you're still going to end up with something non-existent, even if it functions exactly the way that you intend it to. So, first of all, what are the problems with this statement? There's too much evil in this world for there to be a good God. Well, in order for there to be such a thing as evil, there needs to be an objective standard for what good is and isn't. If there's no God, you've either eliminated the concept of good entirely or reduced it to an opinion at best. And understand, people who say that morality is subjective don't live that way. When you ask someone, is it wrong for someone to slash your tires? Well, when I'm the subject and objective, I'd prefer you not to do that. But then they build it up to be, but based on the culture and society that I live in, I found that functionally and based off of my own personal preferences, that subjectively I desire that my tire is full rather than emptied, and especially to avoid scenarios where you're not the cause of those things. That's how I form morality. But already you see two false assumptions there. A, that we ought to pursue human flourishing, that this societal agreement between all of us is absolute. But secondly, whose opinion is being ultimately put forward here? If it is subjective and it's self-determined, why is it that that morality is then imposed on me? Normally they condemn this sort of approach. Don't impose your morality on me, you Christian. I don't need to follow the Ten Commandments. I can be a good person without some book telling me how to live my life. Isn't that exactly what you're doing with me? Aren't you telling me how I ought to live my life by not telling you how you ought to live your life? It's a self-defeating position. But then continuing on from that point and understanding the emphasis, there's more that we can discuss. But in addressing there's too much evil in this world for there to be a good God, we need to ask where that statement came from, because there may be some assumptions there that misunderstand what is meant by God. The statement, and this was most recently at least popularized in Anthony Flou's book God and Philosophy, there can't be a good God and suffering. This is his dilemma. If he was all good, he'd want to do something about suffering. If he was all powerful, he'd be capable of doing something about suffering. If he's not willing, why call him good? If he's not able, then why call him God? Now, Anthony Flue, to his credit, and before he died, he acknowledged the existence of a deity. He didn't necessarily become a Christian as far as we know. But when we're asked the question, okay, what do you do with Anthony Flue's dilemma? Because either way, it puts Christians in a bad light. Well, here's the problem. He does properly acknowledge that an all-powerful being would be by definition God, but also all-knowing, also all-present, also all-capable, but also note that his nature would be the foundation for ethics, morality, and the nature of logic and reason. So when I ask myself the question, could a by definition being be incoherent? I'm canceling myself out. If I call the definition of good evil, I've canceled myself out, because evil and good are opposites. Evil isn't a thing, it's the absence of good. And if you acknowledge a deistic form of morality, and we'll clarify that in a moment here too, then you're realizing that the nature of the one whose opinion, note the subjective morality crowd, created and determined reality itself, then being in line with it would probably make it so that I wouldn't bump into as many things that he put in place. But let's also examine the statement of itself. Anthony Flew actually wasn't the one who came up with this statement. The statement of the dilemma, if there's evil in this universe, could you say there is a good God? This was actually brought up by a Greek philosopher named Epicurus, and Epicurus was a hedonist. Hedonist, or hedonism, is a belief that God is pleasure. He would have been associated with Aphrodite during his time, but generally understood as far as the goal and purpose of life, according to his worldview, that if it feels good, it is good. If it doesn't feel good, then it's not good. Good was his objective standard, correct so far, but he determined that good, his God, was pleasure. And so long as his life and his actions and his behaviors were in line with the nature of his God, feeling good, then he was doing what was good. But here's the problem. Has that ever been what the Christians have put forward as the God of the Bible? Is God's only concern to make us feel good all the time and keep us from as much pain as possible? Take care of us like pets? No, it isn't. And we need to clarify that with people, because this is the false assumption. If we understand Epicurus's assumptions about God, this is actually what the statement, if there's evil in this universe and a good God exists, he should be able to do something about suffering. What do you mean by suffering? Well, not feeling good all the time. So wait a minute, you're not asking why do things in conflict with God's nature exist. You're asking why is it that the God of this universe that you decided should have these set of priorities in order isn't making you feel good all the time? Is that the statement? And they would have to consistently say yes, because this was Epicurus's groundwork. This was his assumption by what God meant. And if you say, okay, so this God that I made up isn't making me feel good all the time, it isn't doing what I decided it should do. Since this God that I made up isn't doing what I decided it should do, then this God that I made up doesn't actually exist. Now, as a Christian, I'm all in favor of that. Disprove your fake God. But don't assume your fake God is the same as the God of the Bible, because we have a different set of values there, a different set of definitions. Anthony Flew was ahead of the curve in that he recognized an all-powerful being is by definition God. But he also didn't consider the origin and the cultural assumptions made in Epicurus' statement, where he said, God is pleasure, and because I'm not feeling good all the time, this God I've decided is supposed to make me feel good all the time isn't making me feel good all the time, therefore this thing that I made up isn't doing what I said it should do. Therefore, this thing that I made up doesn't exist. Bingo. You get it. But if on the other hand you say, oh, well, the God of the Bible, he's like this, right? I mean, forget what the Bible says. We can't trust that. But this is how I decided the God of the Bible is supposed to be. And it isn't doing what I've decided he's supposed to be. Well, again, you haven't disproven God. You've disproven your version and called it God. But that isn't actually what's necessarily there. Unless you got really lucky in an assumption, we would prefer revelation, God telling us what he's like, rather than speculation, us assuming what God ought to do. This is the difference between the Christian and the non-Christian worldview. Now, continuing on from that point then, why is it that this complaint is brought forth in the first place? Well, usually it's because they see evil done in this world, and they wonder, why doesn't God punish it? But understand already, in order for that to be a problem, they've assumed what they're trying to disprove, that God exists. Because if God didn't exist, then this problem wouldn't be an issue in the first place. Now, in all fairness, hypothetically, you can assume something exists to prove the absurdity of it. But if on the other hand you wonder, not only does God not punish evil, or at least not currently, what else are they assuming? Not just that God exists to make their argument, but they also think that they have a better system of values than an all-knowing, an all-powerful being like God. They know better than the God of the universe on how to and when to best punish evil. And this in and of itself is kind of making the same mistake we mentioned earlier, that you know better than God and how he ought to do things. God isn't making me feel good all the time. Well, where did he say that? Well, this is what he ought to do. Wait, so you're saying that God is subject to your opinion as far as what are his system of values, that goodness is determined by you, that you're God, and that God, the God of the universe, is subject to making sure that he fits into your paradigm. I don't believe in a God unless he's the way I made him up to be. Well, now you're back in Epicurus town. And this is the real issue. If you say that A, God exists, you've already lost the argument because an absolutely good being existing is kind of above your pay grade in deciding what he should and shouldn't do. But if you say as well, well, he isn't doing it my way, I don't think he cares. And quite frankly, I don't either. But then building that up a third degree, he also would make the objection, this is the skeptic, in saying that God doesn't have the right to show mercy. And once again, where do you find reason for that? Why is it that when you impose your standards on God, that it's fair, that it's reasonable, that it's rational, but when God imposes his standards on you, being in his universe and all, it's suddenly oppressive, tyrannical, and bigoted? So here are the facts on the table. The existence of morality, that there's evil at all in this world, is actually an argument for God's existence. Until a tangible paragon of moral virtue is provided that applies to all people at all times and all places, we can't explain why we universally have this sense of right and wrong. The moral language of what ought to be implies that there's a set standard that we all recognize and also recognize when it's being violated. So if we wonder, where is the standard that's above and beyond the universe, whose authority determined that standard by... This sounds a lot like God to me. And so on it goes. Likewise, if we understand the God of the Bible, we have certain facts on the table. Most directly, 2 Peter 3 and verse 9, God will hold everyone accountable for how they used or abused the free will that he gave to them. So if you're wondering why doesn't God punish evil, the Bible tells you he's patient, but he also doesn't forget. Evil will be punished, but it's not a matter of will, it's a matter of when. And if God's more patient than you, well, that kind of means that he's better than you at dealing with evil, because he doesn't do so reactively, he does so only out of necessity. Likewise as well, God didn't exempt himself from our suffering. If we think that, oh, God just subjected us all to this like some sort of cosmic sadistic game. No, understand, God was the only one with the right to do that sort of thing. He didn't have to subject himself to the things we brought on ourselves by separating ourselves from him. But when we separated ourselves from him, according to the gospel, he voluntarily became a part of our suffering. In fact, he suffered more than anyone in human history ever has or will, not just physically, but spiritually. That Jesus literally endured hell on that cross so that you wouldn't have to. So if we wonder, A, what gives the atheist, the skeptic, the right to impose his moral standards on God, but not also give the same respect in kind? Secondly, if we recognize God not only knows enough about us, but also about time itself to know when the proper time is to judge all evil in the greatest possible way, but also note as well, we wonder, well, why is it that there's suffering in the first place? Well, understand, we don't have the answer for that, but we do know that we have a God who didn't exempt himself from it, who understands what it's like to go through everything we've been through, because he voluntarily chose to experience what humanity was like and then some. And if that's the kind of God that's out there, then I'd say he is worth serving. He is worth being called God. That because evil exists, I recognize there's something that is not God out there, and it's a problem that I hope he fixes. But here's the other thing too. There wouldn't be a problem to fix if there wasn't already something right in the first place. It's a non-starter. So, once again, this is a very brief answer to a very often emotional issue, but when it comes to the issue in our own hearts, in our own perspectives, and saying, when people are talking about this, it's not really a matter of philosophy, it's more a matter of how could God let this happen to me, they oftentimes don't need the logic in sorting this all out, they need a shoulder. But if on the other hand you want to sort this out in your own mind and say, you know what, that is a good question, why? I hope this has been helpful to you. I can point you to other resources. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norman L. Geisler and Frank Turek, as well as Stealing from God by Frank Turek as well, go into great depths on this. But when it ultimately comes down to it, I just thank you for your time in listening to this study. I hope that you not only take advantage of this, but other videos and channels that have gone into this issue as well, and that it doesn't just go in one ear and out the other. That you're sharing this with people who may actually be caught up in this trap without understanding that it's not actually solving anything, or even suggesting anything for that matter. I'll look forward to talking to you all next time, in which we'll be discussing more of these objections. And until then, God bless you.